They were just two forgotten souls, taking their daily walk through the Arizona wilderness, when they stumbled into a crack in a massive rock formation. And what they found, hidden inside that ancient stone vault, would expose a criminal empire, endanger their lives, and transform them from invisible retirees into the unlikely heroes who brought down a $250 million conspiracy. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The desert morning arrived the way it always did in Copper Ridge, Arizona, silent, golden, and achingly lonely. Walter Brennan stood on the cracked porch of the small mobile home he shared with his wife Grace, watching the sun bleed orange across the distant mountains. At 72 years old, his hands were weathered like the canyon walls he'd once protected as a ranger. His shoulders still broad but bent now under the weight of years that had taken more than they'd given. The lines etched into his face told stories of sun and wind, of decades spent outdoors. But the deepest lines came from grief, the kind that settles into your bones and changes the architecture of who you are. Inside, Grace moved quietly through their cramped kitchen, her silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for 40 years. She was 70, though loss had aged her face beyond her years in ways that had nothing to do with time, and everything to do with the empty spaces where joy used to live. The coffee maker sputtered and hissed, the only sound besides the soft shuffle of her slippers on worn linoleum. She'd learned to move quietly over the years, as if making too much noise might disturb the fragile peace they'd built from the wreckage of their lives. They'd been park rangers once, both of them, meeting in their 20s at the Grand Canyon and spending decades protecting wilderness that most people only saw from lookout points and gift shops. It had been good work, meaningful work, the kind that let you sleep soundly at night, knowing you'd made a difference. They'd raised their daughter Anna in small ranger stations and government housing, teaching her to read animal tracks before she could read books, showing her how to identify plants and predict weather by watching the sky. Those had been the golden years, sun-drenched and full, when their little family of 3 felt like the center of the universe. But that life felt like someone else's memory now, distant and faded like an old photograph, left too long in direct sunlight. Their daughter had died 3 years ago, cancer, swift and merciless, the kind that moves through a body like wildfire through dry brush. Anna had been 41, still young, still vibrant, still full of plans and dreams. She left behind a husband and 2 children, Walter and Grace's grandchildren, who they'd loved with the fierce devotion that grandparents reserve for the next generation. But grief does strange things to families. Anna's husband had remarried within 18 months, a fact that shouldn't have hurt but did, and moved to Oregon with the children. The distance wasn't just geographic. It was emotional, a chasm that widened with each passing month. The letters came less frequently now, short notes accompanying school photos that showed children growing up without them. Phone calls arrived on birthdays and Christmas, brief and polite, the kind that left you feeling more alone than before they rang. The grandchildren called them by their first names now instead of Grandma and Grandpa, a small detail that cut deeper than any knife. Walter and Grace had become strangers to the people they loved most, ghosts haunting the margins of lives that had moved on without them. The pension didn't stretch far in retirement. Social security checks and a modest ranger retirement fund covered the basics, but barely. The mobile home park sat on the forgotten edge of Copper Ridge, where the paved roads gave up and dust took over. where people came when they'd run out of better options. The place had a defeated quality, with rusting cars on blocks and laundry hanging limp in the desert heat. Their neighbors were mostly strangers, people too tired or too broken to make conversation beyond a nod at the communal mailbox. Everyone kept to themselves, protecting their small territories of privacy like animals guarding scarce resources. Inside their mobile home, the walls felt closer every year. The fake wood paneling was yellowed, the carpet threadbare in paths worn by decades of footsteps. The furniture was a mismatched collection of items that had survived multiple moves, things too useful to discard but too worn to feel like home. Photographs lined one wall: Anna as a baby, Anna on her first day of school, Anna's wedding, Anna holding her own babies. Grace couldn't look at them anymore without feeling her throat close up. So she'd stopped looking. The pictures remained, gathering dust, silent witnesses to a life that used to be. "Coffee's ready," Grace called softly from inside, her voice barely carrying through the screen door that never quite closed right, the spring having given up years ago like so many other things. Walter stepped back through the doorway, the morning already warm enough to make his shirt stick to his back. He found Grace at the small Formica table. Two mismatched mugs poured, steam rising in the dim light that filtered through yellowed curtains. They didn't talk much anymore, not because they were angry or distant, but because all the words that mattered had already been said during the long nights after Anna died. The words left now seemed too small for the silence between them, inadequate tools for the weight they carried. They sat together in the kitchen that smelled of old coffee and loneliness, drinking slowly, neither one eager to start a day that would look exactly like the day before and the day before that. Walter's hands wrapped around his mug, knuckles swollen with arthritis, age spots darkening his skin. Grace stared into her coffee like it might contain answers to questions she'd stopped asking. "Thinking of going to Red Canyon today," Walter said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was rough from disuse, gravelly like rocks tumbling in a river. "Been a while since we were out that way." Grace nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the chip in her mug's rim, a familiar imperfection she'd touched 1,000 times. "I'll pack some sandwiches," she said, already standing, already moving toward the refrigerator that hummed too loudly in the small space. That's how it had been for months now, stretching into years. Every few days, they'd drive Walter's old Ford pickup 30 minutes into the desert wilderness, park at an unmarked trailhead most people didn't know existed, and hike for hours through terrain that had once been their workplace, their passion, their purpose. It wasn't about exercise or recreation or any of the reasons people usually ventured into the wild. It was about escape from the walls that felt too close, from the phone that rarely rang, from the quiet ache of being forgotten by a world that no longer needed them or wanted them, or even remembered they existed. Out there in the desert, surrounded by ancient rock and endless sky, they could pretend for a few hours that they still mattered, that their knowledge of these trails still had value, that they were more than just two old people waiting to die in a mobile home at the end of a dirt road in a town nobody cared about. By 8 in the morning, they were bouncing down a rutted dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance since the 90s, when budget cuts had closed ranger stations and let vast tracts of public land slip into bureaucratic neglect. Red Canyon wasn't on any tourist map, wasn't listed in any guidebook, wasn't marked by signs or visitor centers. It was a maze of twisted rock formations, dry washes that only ran during flash floods, and narrow passages carved by water that stopped flowing decades ago. The canyon existed in a strange liminal space, Technically public land, but functionally forgotten, too remote for casual visitors, and too barren to attract developers. Walter had worked this area back in the 70s when it was still under federal protection, back when the Park Service had money and staff, and gave a damn about places that weren't photogenic enough for postcards. He'd walked every mile of these canyons, had mapped trails and documented wildlife, and felt the peculiar satisfaction of being one of the few people who truly knew a place. That knowledge remained, locked in his memory like artifacts in a museum, gathering dust, but still intact. They parked in the shade of a massive boulder that rose from the desert floor like a giant's tooth, the truck ticking as the engine cooled. The silence out here was different from the silence in Town Cleaner somehow. Less oppressive, the kind of quiet that felt natural rather than imposed. Grace handed Walter his worn canvas backpack, sun-faded and patched, while she shouldered her own smaller pack. Neither spoke as they started walking, boots crunching over loose gravel and sun-bleached stone that radiated heat even this early in the morning. For the first hour, they moved in comfortable silence, following a trail only Walter could see, his feet finding the path from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The canyon walls rose gradually around them, layered sandstone in shades of red and orange and cream, striations marking millions of years compressed into stone. Grace trusted Walter's navigation more than any map, trusted the knowledge he'd accumulated over decades of walking these exact paths when they'd both been younger, stronger, when the world had made sense and their daughter had still been alive. "Remember when we found those petroglyphs up near Devil's Arch?" Grace said, pausing to catch her breath, one hand pressed against a boulder for balance. The heat was building, the sun climbing toward its merciless zenith. Walter stopped, turning back to look at her, and something softened in his weathered face. "You cried," he said, and it wasn't an accusation but a memory, gentle and warm. "They were 3,000 years old." "Walter?" Grace replied, her voice carrying both wonder and sadness. "Someone stood right there and carved their story into the rock, poured their life into something permanent. How could I not cry?" He stepped back to where she stood and reached for her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis, despite the years. Their fingers interlocked with the automatic ease of 5 decades together, a gesture so familiar it happened without thought. "You saw the sacred in everything," he said quietly. "Still do." "Used to," she corrected, but squeezed his hand. They stood together for a moment, two old people holding hands in the shadow of ancient stone, both mourning different versions of themselves. The people they'd been before grief hollowed them out, before loneliness became their constant companion, before the phone stopped ringing and the grandchildren stopped calling, and the world moved on without them. Then Walter released her hand and they continued deeper into the canyon, the walls rising higher on either side, the strip of blue sky overhead narrowing to a ribbon. The temperature dropped as the shade deepened, the air cooler and damper where the sun never reached. Walter scanned the rock faces out of habit, decades of training making him notice details. Most people would miss the way water had carved patterns into sandstone, the places where ancient floods had stacked boulders like a giant's careless toys, the subtle variations in color that told stories of geological time. Then he stopped abruptly, his entire body going still in a way that made Grace immediately alert. "What is it?" she asked, moving to his side, following his gaze. Walter tilted his head, staring at a section of rock wall to their left, where the stone was darker than the surrounding formations, almost black, streaked with mineral deposits that created patterns like frozen waterfalls. But it wasn't the color that had caught his attention, wasn't the unusual mineral staining that made him stop. It was the shape, the geometry, the way the darkness formed a vertical line too straight, too clean, too deliberately precise to be natural. "That's not natural," he murmured, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to touch the stone. Grace moved beside him, squinting in the dim light, trying to see what he saw. At first, she didn't understand, didn't perceive anything unusual beyond interesting rock formations and mineral deposits. Then her eyes adjusted, found the angle, and she saw it a vertical crack in the stone, perfectly straight, running from ground level up about 7 feet, its edges too precise, its geometry too perfect to be the result of erosion or geological stress. "Someone carved this," Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper, his fingers tracing the seam with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering an artifact. The stone was cool to the touch despite the desert heat, almost cold, as if the rock itself was different here, denser, less porous. "When?" Grace breathed, moving closer, her own hand joining his on the stone, feeling the unnaturally smooth edges of the carved seam. "I don't know," Walter admitted, his mind racing through possibilities. Could be ancient, could be modern, but someone went to a lot of trouble to hide this, to make it blend with the natural rock face. You'd walk past it 100 times and never notice unless you were looking for it, or unless the light hit it just right like it is now. He pressed his palm flat against the rock, applying gentle pressure. Nothing happened. He pushed harder, leaning his weight into it, and something shifted. Not much, just a faint grinding sound deep inside the stone, the sound of mechanism long dormant stirring reluctantly to life. Grace's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Walter, what did you just do?" "Walter." He pushed again, this time with his shoulder, grunting with effort. The grinding sound grew louder, accompanied by the whisper of stone sliding against stone. Dust began falling from above, a fine powder that caught the light like glitter. Then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the section of rock swung inward like a door, revealing darkness beyond. They stood frozen, staring into the void that had opened before them, their hearts hammering in their chests. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, and completely black beyond the first few feet where sunlight couldn't penetrate. Cool air exhaled from the opening, carrying scents of stone and earth and something else, something metallic and manufactured that didn't belong in this ancient place. "Grace," Walter breathed, his voice shaking slightly, a mixture of fear and excitement that he hadn't felt in years. "I think we just found something. Something important." Grace stared at the opening, every instinct screaming caution, every nerve alive with a combination of terror and curiosity that made her hands tremble. They should leave, should close this stone door and walk away, should pretend they'd never found this impossible entrance carved into living rock. But they didn't move, couldn't move, because for the first time in 3 years, they felt something other than grief and loneliness. They felt alive. Walter fumbled in his backpack for the flashlight he always carried, an old maglite that had seen him through decades of backcountry work. Its body dented and scratched, but still reliable. He clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing not just a crack in the rock but a passage, deliberately carved, shaped by human hands rather than geological forces. "Stay here," Walter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Like hell," Grace replied, pulling her own small flashlight from her pocket. a cheap LED model she'd bought at the dollar store, but which threw surprisingly bright light. After 47 years of marriage, you should know better than to tell me to stay behind. Walter didn't argue because she was right, and because part of him didn't want to enter this strange passage alone, didn't want to discover whatever lay beyond without her beside him. They'd faced everything together for nearly 5 decades, raising a daughter in remote ranger stations, dealing with aggressive wildlife and dangerous weather, holding each other through the worst grief imaginable. Whatever was in this passage, they would face it together too. He stepped through first, shoulders scraping stone, the passage narrower than it had appeared from outside. Grace followed, her breathing shallow, her free hand trailing along the wall for balance. The stone was smooth here, too smooth, worn by countless hands or deliberately polished. The passage was maybe 15 feet long, sloping slightly downward, and the air grew cooler with each step, carrying that strange metallic scent more strongly now. At the end, the passage opened into a chamber. Walter swept his flashlight across the space, and both of them gasped, the sound echoing in the confined area. This wasn't a natural cave or a simple shelter carved into rock. This was a room, deliberately excavated, precisely engineered, hidden within the mountain itself. The ceiling was maybe 12 feet high, supported by natural stone pillars that had been left intact during excavation, their surfaces showing marks where tools had shaped the space around them. The floor was level, covered in a thin layer of undisturbed dust that sparkled in their flashlight beams like frost. But what made Walter's blood run cold? What made Grace grab his arm with fingers that dug into his flesh? Were the walls. They were lined with shelves carved directly into the stone. Dozens of them, precisely cut and evenly spaced. And on those shelves sat containers, metal boxes, plastic crates, military-style ammunition cans, all arranged with military precision, each one carefully placed and organized. The containers were modern, manufactured, completely out of place in this ancient stone chamber. Some were sealed with tape, others with combination locks, all of them deliberately positioned and maintained. "Oh my God," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "Walter, what is this place?" Walter moved deeper into the chamber, his light revealing more details with each step. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden table, solid and well-made, its surface clear, except for a single leather-bound journal, lying open, as if someone had just been reading it moments before. Beside the journal sat a lantern, the old-fashioned kind that ran on kerosene, its glass chimney clean and its reservoir still containing fuel. "Someone's been here," Walter said, his voice tight with tension. "Recently." Grace pointed to the corner where a sleeping bag lay rolled against the wall, beside it a military-issue canteen and a small propane camp stove. The sleeping bag wasn't dusty like everything else, wasn't coated with the fine powder that covered the floor. Neither was the canteen. These items were being used, maintained, part of someone's regular routine. "This is a shelter," Walter continued, his mind working through the implications. "But it's more than that. This is storage. Someone is hiding something here, using this place regularly, keeping whatever's in those containers protected and accessible." Grace moved to the nearest shelf, her hands shaking as she carefully lifted the lid of one of the metal boxes. Inside were stacks of paper documents, wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture. She pulled one out with trembling fingers and unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening as she read. "Walter," she breathed, her face going pale even in the dim light. "These are land deeds, property titles, legal documents. He moved to her side, reading over her shoulder, his own shock growing with each line. The documents were official, complete with stamps and notarizations and signatures. But what made his stomach turn were the names he recognized from news reports over the years. From cases that had made headlines, then disappeared into bureaucratic silence. From investigations that had been mysteriously dropped. Grace moved to another box with growing urgency. This one, heavier, requiring both hands to lift. When she opened it, she froze completely, her breathing stopping for several long seconds. Cash. Bundles and bundles of $100 bills, wrapped in plastic, stacked neatly like bricks. More money than either of them had seen in their entire lives combined. Walter's throat went dry, his mouth suddenly tasting like copper and fear. "Close it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Close it right now, Walter. There must be. Close it," he repeated, more urgently. "We need to leave. We need to leave right now." Unquote. Unquote. But Grace had already moved to the back wall, drawn by something Walter hadn't noticed yet, a steel door set into the rock. Modern and industrial, completely anachronistic in this ancient stone chamber. The door had a keypad lock and a heavy handle. The kind of security you'd find on a bank vault or a military installation. "Walter," she said, her hand hovering over the handle, "what if there's more? What if this is just the beginning? Grace, we don't know what we're dealing with here. We don't know who." She cut him off by pulling on the handle, expecting it to be locked, expecting to find it immovable. But to their mutual shock, it wasn't locked at all. The door swung open with a hydraulic hiss, the sound of pressurized air escaping, revealing another chamber beyond. This one was smaller, more deliberately designed, more like a vault than a room. And inside, arranged on metal racks that looked like they belonged in a high-security facility, were more containers, but these weren't amateur storage. These were professional, expensive, temperature-controlled cases designed to preserve valuable or sensitive materials for decades. Walter's hands shook as he approached the first case, every nerve screaming at him to turn around, to leave, to close these doors and forget they'd ever found this place. But curiosity and horror drove him forward, made his fingers work the latches, made him open the case despite knowing that whatever was inside would change everything. Inside were bearer bonds, unmarked, untraceable financial instruments worth millions, each one negotiable for cash without any record or registration. The paper was high quality, the printing professional, the security features sophisticated. These weren't forgeries or curiosities. They were real, negotiable, worth a fortune. Grace opened another case while Walter stood frozen, and inside she found gold bars, each one stamped with weight and purity marks, each one worth tens of thousands of dollars. The next case held diamonds, loose stones in sealed bags, glittering even in the weak flashlight beam, a fortune in compressed carbon. They moved through the vault in stunned silence, opening case after case, their horror and disbelief growing with each discovery. Cash in multiple currencies, more bonds, rare coins, historical artifacts that belonged in museums, and documents. So many documents, bank account numbers, shell company registrations, names and photographs of people Walter recognized from law enforcement bulletins and news reports, evidence of crimes, of conspiracies, of connections that reached from street-level dealers to corporate boardrooms. Grace's voice came out strangled, barely more than a whisper. "Walter, how much do you think is here?" Walter was doing calculations in his head, adding numbers so large they didn't feel real. Numbers that belonged in news reports about national budgets or corporate mergers, not in hidden vaults discovered by two elderly park rangers on a morning hike. "If I'm right about what these bonds are worth," he said slowly, his voice shaking, "and if those stones are what I think they are, and if even half of this cash is real." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Grace, we're looking at $250 million. Maybe more. Maybe a lot more." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own labored breathing in the close air of the vault. $250 million. Hidden in stone, maintained, still active, still being used. "Who does this belong to?" Grace finally whispered, though part of her already knew, had known since she saw the first bundle of cash, since she recognized the names in the documents. Walter moved back to the outer chamber and picked up the leather-bound journal from the wooden table, his hands trembling as he opened it. The entries were written in Spanish, some in English, dating back years. Names appeared repeatedly, names that made his blood run cold. Coordinates, dates, references to La Organización and El Jefe, and operations that sounded like military campaigns but were clearly criminal enterprises. His blood turned to ice as understanding crystallized. "Cartel," he said flatly, the word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water. "This is cartel money. This whole vault. Everything here. It's a repository for one of the drug cartels operating in the Southwest." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Everything suddenly made sense: the remote location, the sophisticated engineering, the security measures, the maintained supplies. This wasn't an abandoned hideout. This was an active facility, a bank vault carved into living rock, hidden so perfectly that it had remained secret for years, maybe decades. "We have to tell someone," Grace said, her voice high and tight. "The police? The FBI? Someone who can—" "Who?" Walter interrupted, his voice sharp with sudden fear. "The local sheriff who might be on their payroll. The FBI agents who might have connections to these people. Grace, you don't understand. People have died for less than this. People with badges, with families, with government protection. We're two old park rangers who nobody remembers, who nobody would miss. We're completely expendable. So what do we do?" Grace asked, and for the first time in 3 years, Walter heard genuine fear in her voice, not the quiet grief they'd been carrying, but sharp, immediate terror. Walter looked around the vault, at the fortune hidden in stone, at the evidence of crimes that would take years to untangle, at the proof of corruption and violence and evil that someone had worked very hard to keep secret. Then he looked at his wife, this woman who had stood beside him through decades of quiet service, who had helped him survive the worst loss imaginable, who was now standing in a cartel vault, asking him what they should do. And despite the fear coursing through his veins, despite the very real danger they now faced, Walter felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Purpose. He straightened his shoulders, met Grace's terrified eyes, and made a decision. "We document everything," he said firmly. "Every box, every document, every dollar. We photograph it all with my camera. Then we figure out who we can trust, if anyone. Because this," he gestured at the vault around them, "this represents crimes against real people. Victims who never got justice. Families destroyed by drugs and violence. And we're not going to let it stay hidden just because we're scared." Grace stared at him for a long moment, and Walter saw something shift in her expression. saw the fear transform into something else, something harder, something that looked almost like hope. "We're really doing this?" she asked. "We're really doing this," Walter confirmed. They spent the next hour working in focused silence, Walter's old digital camera clicking steadily as he photographed every container, every document, every scrap of evidence. Grace took notes in a small spiral notebook she'd pulled from her backpack, her handwriting shaky but precise, documenting locations and contents, and anything that might be important later. As they worked, the full scope of what they'd found began to crystallize in their minds. This wasn't just a hidden stash of money. This was an active operation, a carefully maintained repository for assets and evidence that someone had deemed too valuable or too dangerous to keep anywhere else. The sleeping bag, the fresh supplies, the maintained security measures, all of it pointed to regular visits, ongoing use, continued relevance, which meant someone would come back. That realization hit Walter like a physical blow, making his hands freeze mid-photograph. Someone would come back. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe in an hour. And when they did, they would know someone had been here, would see the disturbed dust, the opened cases, the evidence of intrusion. "Grace," he said urgently, his voice tight. "We need to leave. Right now." She looked up from her notebook, saw the fear in his eyes, and understood immediately. They'd been so focused on documenting everything that they'd forgotten the most basic rule of survival: don't linger at a crime scene. They grabbed their backpacks, stuffed the notebooks and camera memory cards deep inside, and moved back toward the passage leading out. Walter was pulling the steel vault door closed when Grace grabbed his arm suddenly, her grip painful. "Wait," she hissed. "Listen." He froze, straining his ears. And then he heard it: voices, distant but growing closer, echoing off the canyon walls. Men speaking Spanish, their words bouncing and distorting but unmistakably approaching their location. Walter and Grace pressed themselves against the rock face just inside the passage, hearts hammering so hard they could hear nothing else. Through the narrow crack of the stone door, they could see a section of the canyon floor, and after several agonizing seconds, two men came into view. Both wore jeans and work shirts, nothing remarkable, nothing that would draw attention in any southwestern town. But both also had pistols holstered at their hips, worn with the casual comfort of people who carried weapons regularly. They moved with efficient awareness, scanning their surroundings, talking casually, but watching everything. Walter held his breath, one hand gripping Grace's shoulder, keeping her absolutely still. The men walked directly past the hidden entrance, so close Walter could have reached out and touched them if the door had been open wider. Their conversation was casual, something about a delivery schedule, about El Patron being satisfied with recent deposits, about meeting times and coordinates. They continued down the canyon and disappeared around a bend, their voices fading gradually until only silence remained. Walter and Grace didn't move for a full 5 minutes, counting seconds in their heads, waiting to be sure the men were truly gone. When Walter finally dared to breathe normally again, he looked at his wife and saw his own terror reflected in her eyes. "They're still operating," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "This isn't old, isn't abandoned. They're still using this place, still adding to it." Walter nodded grimly and carefully pulled the stone door closed, wincing at every tiny scrape of rock against rock. When it finally settled back into place, The seam vanished, just another shadow among many in the canyon wall. Invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look and how the light needed to hit it. They didn't speak as they made their way back through the canyon, moving as quickly as their aging legs would carry them. Every sound making them flinch, a bird taking flight, a rock rolling loose underfoot, the wind whistling through narrow passages. By the time they reached Walter's truck, both were drenched in sweat that had nothing to do with the desert heat, and everything to do with adrenaline and fear. Walter started the engine with shaking hands and guided the truck back down the rutted dirt road, checking the rearview mirror compulsively every few seconds, expecting to see vehicles following, guns pointing, their brief moment of discovery about to end in violence. They didn't speak until they were back on paved highway, miles from Red Canyon, the wilderness shrinking in the mirror behind them, looking innocent and empty and completely failing to suggest the deadly secret carved into its stone heart. "What have we done?" Grace finally asked, her voice small and lost, sounding like she had after Anna died, like she couldn't quite believe the reality they'd stumbled into. Walter gripped the steering wheel so hard his arthritic knuckles turned white, pain shooting through his hands but grounding him, keeping him focused. "We found something we weren't supposed to find," he said quietly. "And now we have to decide what kind of people we want to be." Grace was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert flashing past, at the landscape that had once been their workplace, their passion, now transformed into something dangerous and unknown. Then she reached over and placed her hand on top of Walter's, her touch gentle despite the terror coursing through both of them. "We've spent our whole lives protecting places nobody cared about," she said softly, her voice gaining strength. "Documenting wildlife nobody noticed, preserving trails nobody walked. Maybe it's time we protected something that actually matters." Walter glanced at her, this woman he'd loved for 50 years, and saw steel in her eyes that he'd fallen in love with half a century ago, determination that grief had dimmed but not extinguished. "Then we'd better figure out who we can trust," he said. "Because once we start talking about this, once we bring this into the light, there's no taking it back. Our lives will never be the same." "They haven't been the same since Anna died," Grace replied. "Maybe this is why we're still here. Maybe we survived her death for this exact moment." They drove in silence the rest of the way home, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd carried for 3 years. Not the heavy quiet of grief and loneliness, but the tense awareness of people who'd stumbled across something that would either give their lives meaning or end them violently. Back at their mobile home, surrounded by the same thin walls and worn furniture and photographs of a daughter who would never grow older, Walter and Grace sat at their small kitchen table and looked at each other across decades of shared history. They were two forgotten people in a forgotten town, invisible to a world that had moved on without them. But they'd found something that couldn't be ignored, evidence that could bring down criminals and maybe, just maybe, give their remaining years purpose. "So, where do we start?" Grace asked. Walter pulled out his old address book and began flipping through yellowed pages, looking for a name he hadn't thought about in years, hoping that one person from his past might still be someone they could trust. Because their quiet morning hike through Red Canyon had transformed them from anonymous retirees into the only witnesses to one of the biggest criminal operations in the Southwest. And there was no going back. What happens next will turn their quiet discovery into a deadly game of cat and mouse, reveal connections that reach into the highest levels of power, and force two forgotten souls to risk everything they have left. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The evening after their discovery, Walter sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, the glow of his old laptop casting shadows across his weathered face. Grace had finally gone to bed around 11, exhaustion winning over adrenaline, but sleep eluded Walter completely. His mind raced with images of that vault, with the weight of what they'd found, with the terrible knowledge that their lives had irrevocably changed the moment they'd pushed open that stone door. He'd spent hours organizing the photographs on his computer, creating folders, labeling files, building a digital archive of everything they'd documented. 243 photographs in total, each one a piece of evidence, each one potentially deadly. The images told a story that made his hands shake as he sorted them, stacks of currency from 6 different countries. Bearer bonds with values that ran into the millions, documents connecting legitimate businesses to criminal enterprises, photographs of people he recognized from news reports about organized crime. But it was the journal entries that truly chilled him. The journal entries 9s, the 9 tentually side with 9 entries 9s. The tentually. Walter had photographed every page of that leather-bound book, and now, using online translation tools and his own rusty Spanish from years working the border regions, he began to piece together the history of the vault. The earliest entries dated back to 2003, written in a precise hand that suggested military training or formal education. The author, who never identified himself by name, referred to himself only as the Keeper. The entries detailed the construction of the vault, how it had taken 18 months to excavate and engineer, how the stone door had been fabricated in Mexico and transported piece by piece across the border, how the location had been chosen specifically because of its remoteness and its proximity to old ranger trails that had been abandoned after budget cuts. Walter's blood ran cold as he read that last part. They'd chosen this location deliberately because they knew the ranger stations had closed, knew the trails were no longer patrolled, knew that federal presence had evaporated from this section of desert. They'd counted on the government forgetting about these canyons, and they'd been right. The entries continued, detailing deposits and withdrawals, recording visits and maintenance schedules. But what made Walter's stomach turn were the references to operations and payments and eliminations. The Keeper wrote in code sometimes, but the meaning was clear enough. This vault wasn't just storing money, it was funding crimes, drug shipments, human trafficking, assassinations, all financed with the cash and bonds hidden in that stone chamber. One entry from 2007 made Walter stop breathing. El Patron pleased with vault security. Recommends expansion. 4 troublesome witnesses eliminated this quarter. Border agent who got too curious dealt with in Nogales. Local sheriff asking wrong questions had unfortunate accident. System working as designed. Walter pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly in the quiet mobile home. 4 people dead. A border agent. A sheriff. People with badges and authority. People who should have been protected. Eliminated because they'd gotten close to discovering what Walter and Grace had stumbled across by accident. What chance did 2 elderly park rangers have against an organization that killed law enforcement officers? He walked to the window and peered out at the dark mobile home park. Every shadow suddenly looked menacing. Every parked car could be surveillance. The peaceful isolation they'd lived in for 3 years now felt like exposure, vulnerability, danger. His phone sat on the counter. Old and basic. The kind that just made calls and sent texts. Walter picked it up and scrolled through his contacts. Names he hadn't called in years. Colleagues from his ranger days who'd scattered across the country in retirement. Most were probably dead by now, or too old to help, or too disconnected from law enforcement to make a difference. But one name made him pause. Marcus Webb. Marcus had been FBI, assigned to the border region in the late 90s during a major investigation into cartel smuggling routes. He and Walter had worked together when the FBI needed someone who knew the backcountry, who could navigate terrain that didn't show up on maps. They'd spent weeks together in the field, developing the kind of trust that comes from shared danger and mutual respect. That had been over 20 years ago. Marcus would be in his 60s now, probably retired, possibly moved away. But if anyone would understand the gravity of what they'd found, if anyone would know how to handle evidence this explosive, it would be Marcus. Walter checked the time, 1:37 in the morning. Too late to call. Too urgent to wait. He typed out a text message with shaking fingers. Marcus, this is Walter Brennan from the NPS. Need to talk about something urgent. Something that can't wait. Please call when you can. He hit send and set the phone down, not expecting a response until morning. But less than 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed in his hand. Walter. Jesus, man. It's been 20 years. What's going on? Walter felt relief flood through him at the sound of that familiar voice, still sharp despite the years. Marcus. Grace and I found something. Something bad. Something that's going to get us killed if we don't handle it right. There was a pause on the line. When Marcus spoke again, all the casualness was gone. Where are you right now? Home. Our mobile home. In Copper Ridge. Are you safe? Is anyone watching the property? Walter moved back to the window, scanning the darkness. I don't know. I don't think so. But Marcus, these people, they've killed law enforcement before. They've... Stop, Marcus interrupted. Don't say anything else on this line. Cell phones aren't secure. Can you get to a public place tomorrow? Somewhere with people around. Yes. There's a diner off Interstate 10. I know the one. Rosie's. I'll be there at noon. Don't tell anyone you're meeting me. Don't use your credit cards. Pay cash for everything. And Walter? Marcus paused. Whatever you found, don't go back there. Don't even drive near there. These organizations, they watch their assets. They know when someone's been poking around. Walter's mouth went dry. How would they know? Cameras, motion sensors, pressure plates. Hell, sometimes just footprints in the dust. These people are sophisticated. Promise me you'll stay away. I promise, Walter said. But his mind was racing with a terrible realization. They'd spent over an hour in that vault. They'd opened cases, moved things, left footprints everywhere. If Marcus was right, if there were monitoring systems they hadn't noticed. Get some sleep if you can, Marcus said. I'll see you tomorrow at noon. And Walter, I'm glad you called me. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. The line went dead. Walter stood in his kitchen holding a phone that suddenly felt like a lifeline. The only connection to someone who might be able to help them survive what they'd discovered. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark living room with a baseball bat across his lap, watching the windows, listening to every sound. Every car that passed on the distant highway made his heart jump. Every creak of the mobile home settling made him grip the bat tighter. Grace found him there at dawn, still sitting in the same chair, eyes red from lack of sleep, but alert, aware, ready. You didn't come to bed, she said softly, sitting beside him on the worn couch. Couldn't sleep, did some research on what we found. He gestured to the laptop still open on the kitchen table, its screen dark now but containing horrors Grace hadn't seen yet. It's worse than we thought. Much worse. 1. He told her everything, the journal entries, the references to eliminated witnesses, the deliberate choice of location, the scope of the criminal operation they'd stumbled into. Grace's face grew paler with each revelation, her hands clutching the blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders. "We need to go to the police," she whispered when he finished. "And tell them what?" "That we found a cartel vault in the desert." "Grace, the journal mentions paying off local law enforcement. We don't know who's compromised, who can be trusted. For all we know, the Copper Ridge Sheriff is on their payroll. So what do we do?" I contacted Marcus Webb. Remember him? FBI agent from the 90s? We're meeting him at noon today. He'll know how to handle this, who to trust in the bureau. Grace nodded slowly, then stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look outside. The mobile home park was waking up a few early risers heading to work. Someone walking a dog. The normal rhythms of life continuing as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. "Walter," she said quietly, "that white sedan, the one parked 3 spaces down, has it been there all night?" Walter joined her at the window, his heart suddenly pounding. The car was a nondescript white Toyota Camry, at least 10 years old, covered in road dust. It looked like 100 other cars in the park. But now that Grace mentioned it, he didn't recognize it. And there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, just visible through the tinted windshield. "I don't know," Walter admitted. "I've been watching the road, not the park." As they watched, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was young, maybe 30, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt. He stretched casually, looked around the park, then pulled out a cigarette and lit it. Just a guy, taking a smoke break. Nothing suspicious, except he was looking directly at their mobile home. Walter pulled Grace back from the window. "Get dressed," he said quietly. "Pack a small bag. Just essentials. We're leaving early." "Walter, you're scaring me." "Good. Be scared. These people don't mess around. If they've found us, if they know we were in that vault, then every minute we stay here is dangerous." They moved quickly, packing small backpacks with clothes and toiletries, gathering documents and cash. Walter transferring the photographs from his laptop to 3 different USB drives, which he distributed between their bags. Within 20 minutes, they were ready. Walter peered out the window again. The white Camry was still there, but the man was back inside, apparently settled in for a long wait. "We'll go out the back," Walter said. "Cut through the Johnson's lot to the main road, catch a ride into town. We're not taking the truck too easy to follow." "Walter, this is insane. We're running from our own home because of a man smoking a cigarette." He turned to face her, his expression harder than she'd seen in years. "That man has been sitting in his car for hours watching our home. That's not normal. And after what I read last night, after learning what these people do to witnesses, I'm not taking any chances. We leave now, quietly, and we don't come back until we've talked to Marcus." They slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as 2 70-year-olds could manage, cutting through yards and between mobile homes toward the main road half a mile away. Walter kept checking behind them, expecting to see the man following, but there was no sign of pursuit. At the main road, they waited until a local transit bus appeared, waving it down and climbing aboard. The driver gave them a curious look, This route didn't usually get passengers from the mobile home park, but accepted their cash fare without comment. They rode the bus into town, transferring twice, using the kind of evasive techniques Walter had learned from action movies and Marcus's old stories about surveillance. By the time they reached Rosie's diner at 10:30, 2 hours early, they were reasonably certain no one had followed them. The diner was a classic truck stop establishment that had been serving the same mediocre coffee and eggs since the 70s. At this hour, it was mostly empty, a few truckers at the counter, a tired waitress refilling coffee pots. Walter and Grace took a booth in the back corner where they could watch the entrance, ordered coffee they didn't drink, and waited. Marcus Webb walked in at 11:55, exactly 5 minutes early. He'd aged since Walter last saw him. His hair was more gray than brown now, his face lined with the kind of wear that comes from years of seeing humanity's worst. But his eyes were still sharp, still alert, still the eyes of someone who noticed everything. He spotted them immediately, crossed the diner in long strides, and slid into the booth, across from them. For a long moment, he just looked at them, taking in their exhaustion, their fear, their barely suppressed panic. "You look like hell," he said finally. "We feel worse," Walter replied. "Thanks for coming, Marcus. Before we talk," Marcus pulled out his cell phone and turned it off completely, then gestured for them to do the same. "Anything you say might be monitored if these phones are on. Government surveillance isn't the only kind we need to worry about." Once all 3 phones were off, Marcus leaned forward. "Okay, tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." Walter told the story: the morning hike, the hidden entrance, the vault carved into stone, the fortune in cash and bonds and evidence. He told him about the journal entries, about the references to eliminated witnesses, about the men they'd seen passing the vault entrance. Grace added details he forgot, describing the sophisticated security, the maintained supplies, the clear evidence of ongoing use. When they finished, Marcus sat back in the booth, his expression grim. "Do you have proof? Photos? Documentation? Anything?" Walter pulled out one of the USB drives and slid it across the table. Marcus pocketed it without looking at it. "I'll review this somewhere secure, but based on what you're telling me, I think I know which organization we're dealing with. The Vasquez Cartel. They've been operating in this region for 20 years, and we've never been able to get close to their financial operations. We've arrested street dealers and mid-level distributors, but the money, the real power, has always been untouchable. So this vault," Grace started, "could be their central repository," Marcus finished. "The place where they store operational funds, pay off corrupt officials, finance new operations. Walter, Grace, if what you've found is what I think it is, this could bring down one of the most violent criminal organizations in the Southwest. Or get us killed," Walter said flatly. Marcus didn't deny it. "Yes, or that. These people have resources, connections, and they've made it very clear what happens to witnesses. I won't lie to you. The moment you walked into that vault, you put yourselves in danger. We think they might already know," Grace said quietly. "This morning, there was a man watching our home. A car we didn't recognize, parked where he could see our door." Marcus's expression darkened. Did he follow you here?" "We don't think so. We took precautions, used public transit, watched for tails." "Good. That might buy us some time. But you can't go home, not until we figure out what we're dealing with and how to protect you." "For how long?" Walter asked. I don't know. Days, weeks, maybe longer. These investigations take time, and your safety is paramount. Marcus pulled out a different phone, this one clearly a burner, and made a quick call. He spoke in clipped sentences using terms Walter didn't understand, then hung up. I'm arranging protective custody. There's a safe house about 40 miles north of here. You'll stay there while I figure out who I can trust in the Bureau, who can help us move on this information without compromising your safety. We have a grandson, Grace said suddenly. In Oregon. If these people go after family, give me his contact information. We'll reach out, offer protection if he wants it. These organizations do look for leverage, for people they can threaten or hurt, to keep witnesses quiet. Marcus pulled out a notepad. Anyone else? Friends? Family? People you're close to? Walter and Grace looked at each other, and something passed between them, a realization both sad and liberating. No, Walter said quietly. There's no one else, just us and Noah. The safe house was exactly what Walter expected. Isolated, secure, anonymous. An old ranch house tucked into the foothills where the desert met scrub pine, surrounded by emptiness that would make any approach visible for miles. 2 agents rotated shifts, young and professional, treating Walter and Grace with polite distance. The first 3 days passed in anxious waiting. Marcus visited once, bringing updates and asking more questions, reviewing the photographs with growing intensity. He confirmed their worst fears: the vault was definitely connected to the Vasquez organization, and the journal entries matched suspected operations going back nearly 2 decades. We're building a case, Marcus told them on his 3rd visit, but it's delicate. I'm only bringing in people I absolutely trust, agents I've worked with for years. The problem is, some of the names in your photographs, some of the people on the cartel payroll, they're connected to law enforcement, to banking, even to state government. This goes deep, Walter. Deeper than I've ever seen. On the 4th day, Grace was in the kitchen making tea when she heard Walter's voice from the living room, strained and urgent. She rushed in to find him staring at his phone. They'd been given new burner phones for emergencies. His face pale. What is it? She asked. Walter held up the phone so she could see the text message. We know what you found. We know where you are. Give back what you took, and no one gets hurt. You have 48 hours. The number was blocked, untraceable, but the message was crystal clear. Grace felt her legs go weak. How did they get this number? This phone is new, Walter finished. Supposedly secure, which means either they're incredibly sophisticated or someone on our side isn't, Grace whispered. Walter called Marcus immediately. The FBI agent arrived within an hour, his expression grave as he read the text. This changes things, he said. If they found this number, if they know you're under protection, then we have a leak. Someone in the Bureau, or someone with access to Bureau communications. What do we do? Walter asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought through options. We accelerate the timeline. I was planning to take weeks building an airtight case, bringing in federal prosecutors, coordinating with other agencies. But if they're threatening you now, if they're getting close, we need to move faster. Tomorrow, I'm bringing in Linda Castellanos, a special prosecutor I've worked with for 15 years. She's clean. I'd stake my career on it. We'll lay out everything you've found, and she'll make the call on how to proceed. And if they make good on their threat? Grace asked. If they come here? Then we move you again. and again if necessary. But Walter, Grace, I need you to understand something. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. What you found could dismantle a criminal network responsible for hundreds of murders, billions in drug trafficking, and corruption that reaches into the highest levels of power. But it also makes you the biggest threat this organization has ever faced. They will spend enormous resources trying to silence you. The only way you survive this is if we move fast enough to arrest the key players before they can get to you. That night, Walter couldn't sleep again. He stood at the window of the safe house, watching the dark landscape, thinking about how quickly their quiet life had transformed into something from a thriller novel. Just days ago, they'd been two lonely old people taking a walk, invisible and forgotten. Now they were at the center of a criminal investigation, being threatened by one of the most violent cartels in North America. Grace joined him at the window, slipping her hand into his. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked softly. "Maybe we should just give them the USB drives, destroy the photographs, pretend we never saw anything." Walter was quiet for a long moment. 4 people, he finally said. That's how many the journal mentioned eliminating in 1 quarter. 4 people who got too curious, who asked too many questions. That border agent, that sheriff, 2 others, not even named. They died because they stumbled onto something, and the cartel made them disappear. He turned to face Grace, his eyes reflecting the dim light from outside. If we walk away now, if we let fear make us quit, then those 4 people died for nothing. And every future victim, everyone who gets hurt by the drugs or the violence or the corruption funded by that vault, their blood is partly on our hands, because we could have stopped it, and chose not to. Even if it costs us our lives? Grace asked. Even then, Walter said firmly. Anna used to ask us why we spent so much time protecting empty wilderness, why we cared so much about places most people would never see. Remember what you told her? Grace smiled sadly. I said that just because something is invisible doesn't mean it doesn't matter. That someone needs to care about the forgotten places, the overlooked things, because that's where real value often hides. Exactly. Well, we've been invisible for 3 years. Forgotten, overlooked, dismissed as irrelevant. But maybe we were meant to find that vault specifically, because we're the kind of people who notice what others miss, who care about things others overlook. Maybe our whole lives have been preparing us for this exact moment. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder. When did you become so philosophical? When I realized I'd rather die standing for something than live another 3 years waiting for a phone call that never comes. The next morning, Linda Castellanos arrived at the safe house. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd prosecuted major cases and won. Marcus introduced her, and for the next 6 hours, they went through everything, every photograph, every document, every detail of what Walter and Grace had found. Castellanos asked pointed questions, challenged inconsistencies, pushed for more detail, but as the evidence mounted, as the scope of what they'd discovered became clear, her expression shifted from skeptical to shocked to determined. This is unprecedented, she finally said, leaning back in her chair. I've prosecuted cartel cases for 20 years, but I've never seen evidence this comprehensive, this damning. If we can authenticate all of this, if we can secure that physical location and verify the contents, we're looking at charges against dozens of individuals, maybe hundreds. Drug trafficking, money laundering, murder conspiracy, racketeering, corruption, bribery of public officials. This could take down an entire organization from street level to executive leadership. But, Walter prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation, but it also means you're in more danger than you can imagine. Castellanos continued. The organization you've exposed, they have resources beyond anything you've encountered. They will find you if we're not extraordinarily careful. They will threaten you, try to discredit you, and if none of that works, they will try to eliminate you. We already got a threat, Grace said quietly, then explained about the text message. Castellanos exchanged a long look with Marcus. Then we're out of time. We need to make a decision today about how to proceed. What are our options? Walter asked. Option 1, Castellanos said. You walk away. You destroy the evidence, claim you made a mistake, and we put you in witness protection somewhere far from here with new identities. You live out your lives in safety but in secret. No, Walter and Grace said simultaneously. Option 2, Castellanos continued without surprise. We move forward with the investigation, secure the vault location, build cases against multiple defendants, and bring charges. This means months of your lives spent in protective custody, eventual testimony at trial, and permanent visibility. Your names will be in every news report, every document. You'll never be anonymous again. And they'll never stop coming after us, Grace said. Not never, Marcus interjected. Once the key players are arrested, once their organization is dismantled, the threat diminishes significantly. Not to zero, but to manageable levels. You'd still need protection during the trial process, probably for some time after. But eventually, you could return to some version of normal life. What's option 3? Walter asked. Castellanos smiled grimly. There isn't one. You either walk away, or you commit fully to seeing this through. Half measures will just get you killed. Walter looked at Grace, having one of those silent conversations that 50 years of marriage makes possible. He saw determination in her eyes, saw the same conclusion he'd reached reflected back at him. We're in, he said. All the way. Whatever it takes. Castellanos nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. Then we start immediately. Marcus, I want a tactical team assembled within 48 hours. We need to secure that vault location before anyone can remove or destroy evidence. Walter, Grace, I need you to provide exact coordinates, detailed maps, everything you can remember about the interior layout. What about our grandson? Grace asked. Noah. He's at Oregon State. If these people go after him. Already handled, Marcus said. I reached out yesterday. He's agreed to protective custody voluntarily. He'll be brought to a secure location today. Grace felt tears prick her eyes. He agreed? He's coming? He said. It was about time he saw his grandparents again, Marcus replied gently. That he'd been a coward for staying away after your daughter died. And if you were brave enough to face down a cartel, the least he could do was be brave enough to face his grief. For the first time in days, Walter felt something besides fear. He felt hope. That evening, as they prepared detailed maps and diagrams for the tactical team, as they relived every moment in that vault to help prosecutors understand what they'd found, Walter realized that something fundamental had shifted. They weren't victims anymore, weren't passive witnesses waiting to be saved or silenced. They were active participants in bringing justice to a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades. They were using skills learned over a lifetime observation, documentation, knowledge of terrain, to fight back against people who thought they were untouchable. The phone buzzed again around 8 that evening. Another text from the blocked number. Time is running out. Last chance to walk away. We know about the FBI. We know about the safe house. Nowhere is safe. Walter showed the message to Marcus, who'd stayed late to coordinate with his tactical team. They're getting desperate, Marcus observed, trying to scare you into quitting before we can move. Is it working? Walter asked. Marcus studied his old friend's face, saw the exhaustion, saw the fear, but also saw something he recognized from their time together decades ago. Stubborn determination, the kind that doesn't break under pressure. No, Marcus said. I don't think it is. Walter smiled grimly. Good. Because I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of being invisible. For 3 years, Grace and I have been ghosts, barely existing, just waiting to die. But this, fighting this, it makes me feel alive again. Makes me feel like maybe there's a reason we survived losing Anna. A reason we're still here. That's a dangerous attitude, Marcus warned. These people aren't movie villains. They're real. They're violent. And they've killed better protected people than you. I know, Walter said. But we're not backing down. We found something that matters. Something that could save lives and stop monsters. So, you do your job, build your case, make your arrests. We'll do ours, stay alive long enough to testify, and see this through to the end. Marcus gripped Walter's shoulder. You're braver than most agents I know. Both of you. Not brave, Walter corrected. Just done being afraid. There's a difference. As Marcus left to continue coordinating the operation, as the safe house settled into uneasy quiet, Walter sat with Grace on the worn couch and held her hand. No regrets? He asked quietly. Hundreds, she replied honestly, but none about this. You were right earlier, our whole lives prepared us for this moment. We just never knew it until now. Outside, darkness covered the foothills like a blanket, hiding whatever threats might be gathering. But inside, 2 elderly park rangers sat together and planned not how to run or hide, but how to help bring down an empire built on blood and corruption. They were forgotten no more. What happens next will turn their quiet discovery into a deadly game of cat and mouse, reveal connections that reach into the highest levels of power, and force 2 forgotten souls to risk everything they have left. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The evening after their discovery, Walter sat at the kitchen table long past midnight, the glow of his old laptop casting shadows across his weathered face. Grace had finally surrendered to exhaustion around 11, her body demanding rest, even as her mind raced with images of that stone vault and everything hidden within it. But sleep eluded Walter completely. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those stacks of cash, those bearer bonds, those documents that connected legitimate businesses to murders and drug trafficking. His hands trembled slightly as he organized the photographs on his computer, creating folders with careful precision, labeling files with dates and descriptions. 243 photographs in total. Each one a piece of evidence. Each one potentially deadly. The images told a story that made his stomach turn. Stacks of currency from 6 different countries. Bearer bonds with values that climbed into the millions. Documents connecting city councilmen to cartel operations. Photographs of people he recognized from news reports about organized crime in the Southwest. But it was the journal entries that truly chilled his blood. that made him understand the full scope of what they'd stumbled into. Walter had photographed every page of that leather-bound book, and now, using online translation tools for the Spanish passages and his own rusty knowledge from years working the border regions, he began piecing together the vault's dark history. The earliest entries dated back to 2003, written in a precise hand that suggested military training or formal education. The author never identified himself by name, referring to himself only as the Keeper, and his entries detailed everything with the methodical precision of someone documenting an important project. The construction alone had taken 18 months, he wrote. 18 months of careful excavation, of hauling equipment into remote desert, of engineering a space that would remain hidden and functional for decades. The stone door had been fabricated in a machine shop in Hermosillo, Mexico, then transported piece by piece across the border, hidden in legitimate construction shipments. Each piece had been carried into the canyon on foot, assembled on site, calibrated to move smoothly despite weighing hundreds of pounds. Walter read one entry 3 times, his throat tightening with each reading. Location chosen specifically for remoteness and proximity to abandoned federal lands. Budget cuts closed ranger stations throughout this sector in 1998. No federal presence within 50 miles. Perfect operational security. They'd known. The cartel had deliberately chosen this location because they'd researched government cutbacks, because they'd identified exactly which public lands had been abandoned by budget cuts and bureaucratic neglect. They'd counted on the government forgetting about these canyons, and they'd been absolutely right. The entries continued year after year, each one documenting deposits and withdrawals, recording visits and maintenance schedules. But what made Walter's hands shake, what made him want to vomit, were the casual references to violence, to crimes committed and funded by the money in that vault. Operation Desert Rose successful. 50 kilos distributed Phoenix corridor. Net profit $2.3 million. 3 rival dealers eliminated. Market share increased 12%. Payment delivered to Senator's aide as requested. Highway construction contract secured. New smuggling route operational by spring. Border Patrol agent asking too many questions about canyon access. Situation resolved. Body found in Nogales. Ruled robbery gone wrong. Entry after entry. Year after year. A chronicle of drugs and death and corruption. All written in the same precise hand, as if recording the weather or grocery lists. The casual nature of the violence was somehow worse than explicit descriptions would have been. People died, and the Keeper wrote about it, like reporting quarterly earnings. One entry from 2007 made Walter push back from the table, his chair scraping loudly in the quiet mobile home. El Patron pleased with vault security and operational results. Recommends expansion to additional locations. 4 troublesome witnesses eliminated this quarter. Border agent, who discovered transit routes, dealt with in Nogales. Local sheriff investigating money laundering had unfortunate accident on Highway 87. City councilman threatening to expose connections fell from hotel balcony in Tucson. State auditor asking questions about shell corporations found in his car at bottom of Lake Pleasant. System working as designed. No exposure risk detected. 4 people dead in 3 months. A border agent, a sheriff, a city councilman, a state auditor. People with badges and authority, people investigating crimes, people trying to do the right thing eliminated because they'd gotten close to discovering what Walter and Grace had stumbled across by pure accident. Walter stood abruptly, his legs unsteady, and walked to the small window overlooking the mobile home park. He pulled the thin curtain aside and stared out into darkness. Every shadow suddenly looked menacing. Every parked car could contain someone watching. The peaceful isolation he and Grace had lived in for 3 years, the loneliness that had felt oppressive, now felt like exposure, like vulnerability, like standing naked in a spotlight. What chance did 2 elderly park rangers have against an organization that killed federal agents and elected officials? They had no protection, no authority, no resources. They were just 2 forgotten people living in a mobile home at the end of a dirt road. And they'd accidentally discovered the one thing that could bring down a criminal empire, which meant that empire would do absolutely anything to silence them. Walter's phone sat on the counter, old and basic, the kind that just made calls and sent simple text messages. He picked it up with trembling fingers and scrolled through his contacts. Names he hadn't called in years. Colleagues from his ranger days who'd scattered across the country in retirement. Most were probably dead by now, or too old to help, or too disconnected from law enforcement to make any difference. But one name made him pause, made hope flicker in his chest. Marcus Webb. Marcus had been FBI, assigned to the border region in the late 90s during a major investigation into cartel smuggling routes through federal lands. He and Walter had worked together when the Bureau needed someone who knew the backcountry, who could navigate terrain that didn't show up on any maps, who understood how smugglers used forgotten canyons and abandoned trails. They'd spent weeks together in the field, camping in remote locations, tracking movements, documenting routes. They'd developed the kind of trust that comes from shared danger and mutual respect, from relying on each other when miles from help. That had been over 20 years ago. Marcus would be in his 60s now, probably retired, possibly moved away from Arizona entirely. But if anyone would understand the gravity of what they'd found, if anyone would know how to handle evidence this explosive without getting them killed, it would be Marcus. Walter checked the time on the microwave, 1:37 in the morning. Too late to call. Too important to wait until morning. He typed out a text message with shaking fingers, deleting and rewriting 3 times before settling on. Marcus, this is Walter Brennan from the National Park Service. Need to talk about something urgent. Something that can't wait. Please call when you can. He hit send and set the phone down, not expecting a response until morning at the earliest. But less than 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed in his hand, startling him so badly he nearly dropped it. Walter. Jesus. Man, it's been 20 years? What's going on? Walter felt relief flood through him at the sound of that familiar voice, still sharp and alert, despite the late hour, despite the decades. Marcus, Grace and I found something today. Something bad. Something that's going to get us killed, if we don't handle it exactly right. There was a pause on the line, and when Marcus spoke again, all the casual friendliness had evaporated. Where are you right now? Are you at home? Yes, our mobile home in Copper Ridge. Same place we've been for 3 years. Are you safe? Is anyone watching the property? Any unusual activity? Strange cars? People you don't recognize? Walter moved back to the window, scanning the darkness with new paranoia, seeing threats in every shadow. I don't know. I don't think so. But Marcus, the people involved in this, they've killed law enforcement officers before. They've eliminated federal agents, local sheriffs. Stop. Marcus interrupted sharply. Don't say anything else on this line. Cell phones aren't secure, even basic ones. Even if you think your phone is safe, it probably isn't. Can you get to a public place tomorrow? Somewhere with people around. Somewhere you can be safe in a crowd. Yes. There's a diner off Interstate 10 near the Buckeye exit. Rosie's. We used to. Rosie's a diner off times. I know the one. I remember. I'll be there at noon. Sharp. Don't tell anyone you're meeting me. Don't mention my name to anyone. Don't use your credit cards for anything. Pay cash. And Walter? Marcus paused, and Walter could hear the weight in that silence. Whatever you found, don't go back there. Don't even drive near there. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. Don't do anything that might indicate you're still interested. These organizations, the sophisticated ones, they watch their assets. Motion sensors, cameras, sometimes just footprints in the dust. They know when someone's been poking around where they shouldn't be. Walter's blood turned to ice. How would they know? We were careful. We didn't. It doesn't matter how careful you were. If they're as professional as I think they are, if this is connected to what I suspect, they have monitoring systems you wouldn't have noticed. Pressure plates in the floor, cameras disguised as rocks, infrared motion detectors. Trust me, if you spent any significant time at the location, they probably already know someone was there. Walter thought about the hour they'd spent in that vault. Opening cases, moving containers, walking through every inch of the space. He thought about their footprints in the dust, the way they'd disturbed everything, the trail they must have left. If Marcus was right, if there were systems monitoring that location, how much danger are we in? Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I won't know until you tell me everything tomorrow. But Walter, these people don't take chances. They don't leave witnesses. If they think you're a threat, they'll move quickly. Marcus paused again. Get some sleep if you can. Set your alarm. Be at that diner at noon exactly. And Walter, I'm glad you called me. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. You're not alone anymore. The line went dead. Walter stood in his kitchen, phone in hand, feeling both relieved that Marcus was willing to help and terrified by the urgency in his friend's voice. He'd never heard Marcus sound like that before, not in all those weeks they'd worked together in the backcountry. Not even when they'd come close to stumbling into armed smugglers. This was different. This was worse. Walter didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the dark living room with an old baseball bat across his lap. The aluminum one he'd used for softball games back when he was younger, when Anna was still a child, when life made sense. He positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the window, watching for any sign of movement, listening to every sound. Every car that passed on the distant highway made his heart jump. Every creak of the mobile home settling made him grip the bat tighter. The refrigerator's hum sounded like approaching footsteps. The wind, rattling a loose piece of siding, sounded like someone testing the door. By the time dawn began to gray the eastern sky, his nerves were stripped raw, his back aching from sitting rigid for hours, his hands cramping from clutching the bat. Grace found him there at dawn, still sitting in the same chair, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but alert, hyper, aware of everything. You didn't come to bed, she said softly, settling beside him on the worn couch, pulling her bathrobe tighter against the morning chill. Couldn't sleep. Did some research on what we found. He gestured toward the laptop still open on the kitchen table, its screen dark now, but containing horrors Grace hadn't seen yet. It's worse than we thought, Grace. So much worse than we imagined. He told her everything, the journal entries, the references to eliminated witnesses, The deliberate choice of location specifically because federal presence had been cut from the area, the scope of the criminal operation they'd stumbled into. He told her about the border agent killed in Nogales, the sheriff who'd had an accident, the city councilman who'd fallen from a hotel balcony, the state auditor found drowned in his car. Grace's face grew paler with each revelation, her hands clutching the blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders, her knuckles white. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "We need to go to the police," she finally whispered, her voice thin and frightened. "And tell them what?" "That we found a cartel vault in the desert." Walter shook his head. "Grace, the journal specifically mentions paying off local law enforcement. It talks about sheriff's deputies on the payroll, about police officers providing security for shipments. We don't know who's compromised, who can be trusted. For all we know, the Copper Ridge Sheriff is one of them. We walk into that station, and we might be signing our death warrant. So, what do? Just sit here and wait for them to find us?" "No. I contacted Marcus Webb. Remember him? FBI agent from the 90s. The one who worked with me on that smuggling investigation. We're meeting him at noon today. He'll know how to handle this, who to trust in the Bureau, how to move forward without getting us killed." Grace nodded slowly, then stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly to look outside. The mobile home park was waking up to a normal Sunday morning, a few early risers heading to their cars, someone walking a small dog, newspapers being collected from doorsteps. The normal rhythms of life continuing as if the world hadn't fundamentally shifted, as if everything wasn't balanced on a knife's edge. "Walter," she said quietly, her voice careful, "that white sedan, the one parked 3 spaces down from us, near the Johnsons' place. Has it been there all night?" Walter joined her at the window instantly, his exhaustion forgotten, adrenaline spiking through his system. The car was a nondescript white Toyota Camry, at least 10 years old, covered in the kind of road dust that came from driving desert highways. It looked like 100 other cars in the park, completely unremarkable. But now that Grace mentioned it, Walter didn't recognize it. And there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, barely visible through the tinted windshield, just a shadow and the occasional glow of what might be a phone screen. "I don't know," Walter admitted, his throat tight. "I've been watching the road access, the main routes in and out of the park. I didn't pay attention to vehicles already here." As they watched, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was young, maybe 30, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that could have belonged to an office worker or a delivery driver. He stretched casually, looked around the park with the easy manner of someone who belonged there, then pulled out a cigarette and lit it, taking a long drag. Just a guy having a smoke break. Nothing suspicious at all. Except he was looking directly at their mobile home. Not obviously, not in a way that would seem strange to anyone else. But his eyes kept returning to their door, their windows, tracking movement inside with the subtle attention of someone doing surveillance. Walter pulled Grace back from the window, his heart hammering. "Get dressed," he said quietly, urgently. "Pack a small bag. Just essentials, clothes for a few days, medications, toiletries, important documents. Move quickly, but don't panic." "Walter, you're scaring me." "Good. Be scared. Stay scared. These people don't mess around. Don't give warnings. Don't make mistakes. If they've found us, if they know we were in that vault, then every minute we stay here is borrowed time." They moved through the mobile home quickly, Grace gathering clothes and necessities, while Walter transferred the photographs from his laptop to 3 different USB drives, distributing them between their bags so that if one was taken or lost, they'd still have copies. He grabbed their important documents, birth certificates, social security cards, bank statements, and divided those up too. Within 20 minutes, they were packed and ready. Walter peered out the window again, carefully staying to the side so he wouldn't be silhouetted. The white Camry was still there, but the man was back inside now, apparently settled in for a long wait. Waiting for them to make a move. "We'll go out the back," Walter said, his mind racing through options. "Cut through the Johnsons' lot, then the Mendozas, work our way around to the main road. We're not taking the truck, too easy to follow, too visible. We'll catch the local transit bus into town." "Walter, this is insane. We're running from our own home because of one man smoking a cigarette in a car." He turned to face her, his expression harder than she'd seen in years, harder than it had been even during the worst days after Anna's death. "That man has been sitting in his car for hours watching our home at 6 in the morning. That's not normal. That's not a neighbor waiting for a friend or a delivery driver taking a break. And after what I read last night, after learning what these people do to witnesses, after seeing the names of the people they've eliminated, I'm not taking any chances. We leave now, quietly. And we don't come back until we've talked to Marcus and figured out how to survive this." They slipped out the back door, moving as quietly as 2 70-year-olds could manage, their backpacks slung over shoulders that were too old for this kind of thing. They cut through the narrow space between mobile homes, stepping carefully over dried desert plants and trash that had accumulated in forgotten corners. Walter kept checking behind them, expecting to see the man from the Camry following, expecting to hear shouts or running footsteps, but there was no sign of pursuit. They worked their way through 3 different lots, staying low when passing windows, moving quickly through open spaces. By the time they reached the main road half a mile away, both were breathing hard, their hearts pounding more from fear than exertion. At the main road, they waited in the meager shade of a bus stop shelter, Walter constantly scanning for the white Camry, for any sign they'd been followed. The local transit bus appeared 15 minutes later, and they climbed aboard, paying cash, taking seats near the back where they could watch the entrance. The driver gave them a curious look. This route didn't usually get passengers from the mobile home park, especially not elderly couples with backpacks, but accepted their fare without comment. They rode the bus into town, transferring twice, using evasive techniques Walter had learned from action movies and half-remembered stories from Marcus about avoiding surveillance. By the time they reached Rosie's diner at 10:30, 2 hours early for their meeting, they were reasonably certain no one had followed them. But reasonably certain wasn't the same as absolutely sure, and Walter couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on his back, of being watched by forces he couldn't see. Rosie's Diner was a classic truck stop establishment that had been serving the same mediocre coffee and greasy eggs since the 70s. The building was long and low, with a gravel parking lot full of semis, and the kind of worn-out cars driven by people for whom a meal out was a luxury. At this hour on a Sunday morning, it was mostly empty, a few truckers hunched over coffee at the counter, a tired waitress with bleached hair refilling coffee pots, the smell of bacon and burned toast hanging in the air. Walter and Grace took a booth in the back corner, positioned so they could watch the entrance and see anyone who came in. They ordered coffee they didn't drink, their hands wrapped around warm mugs more for comfort than warmth. Every time the door opened, Walter tensed, expecting to see someone who looked wrong, who moved like a threat. But it was just truckers coming and going. A family with young children, an elderly man reading a newspaper. The minutes crawled past. Walter checked his watch compulsively. 10:45. 11. 11:15. Grace stared at the entrance, barely blinking, her coffee growing cold in front of her. Marcus Webb walked in at 11:55, exactly 5 minutes early. He'd aged since Walter last saw him. His hair was more gray than brown now, cut short and practical. His face lined with the kind of permanent wear that comes from years of witnessing humanity's worst impulses. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement, his eyes scanning the diner before he'd fully entered, cataloging every person, every exit, every potential threat. He wore jeans and a casual jacket. But there was a bulge under the left side that Walter recognized as a concealed carry holster. Marcus spotted them immediately, crossed the diner in long strides that covered ground quickly without seeming hurried, and slid into the booth across from them. For a long moment, he just looked at them, really looked, taking in their exhaustion, their fear, their barely suppressed panic. "You look like hell," he said finally, his voice low and concerned. "We feel worse," Walter replied. "Thanks for coming, Marcus. I know it's been a long time, and asking you to drive out here on a Sunday morning." "Before we talk," Marcus interrupted, pulling out his cell phone and turning it completely off, removing the battery for good measure. He gestured for them to do the same. "Anything you say might be monitored if these phones are on. Government surveillance isn't the only kind we need to worry about. These cartels, the sophisticated ones, they have access to the same technology as law enforcement, sometimes better." Once all 3 phones were disassembled on the table, Marcus leaned forward, his expression grave. "Okay, tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. I need every detail, no matter how small it seems." Walter told the story from the beginning: the morning hike into Red Canyon, the strange seam in the rock face, the hidden entrance that shouldn't exist, the vault carved impossibly into stone. He described the shelves lined with containers, the wooden table with its leather journal, the steel door leading to an inner sanctum filled with bearer bonds and gold and diamonds and cash beyond counting. Grace added details he forgot, describing the sophisticated security measures they'd noticed only in retrospect, the maintained supplies that proved someone visited regularly, the clear evidence of ongoing use rather than abandonment. She told him about the documents they'd found, the names and connections that suggested corruption reaching into government and law enforcement. When they mentioned the journal and the entries about eliminated witnesses, Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. When Walter described the specific references to the border agent in Nogales and the sheriff's accident, Marcus's eyes went hard and cold. "Do you have proof?" Marcus asked when they finished. "Photos, documentation, anything physical." Walter pulled out one of the USB drives from deep in his backpack and slid it across the scarred Formica table. Marcus pocketed it immediately without looking at it, without drawing attention to the exchange. "I'll review this somewhere secure," Marcus said. "But, based on what you're telling me, I'm 90% certain I know which organization we're dealing with. The Vasquez Cartel. They've been operating in this region for over 20 years, and we've never been able to get close to their financial operations. We've arrested street dealers, mid-level distributors, even a few regional managers. But the money, the real power structure, has always been untouchable. Every time we get close to their financial networks, Evidence disappears. Witnesses recant. Investigators get reassigned or threatened, or worse. So this vault we found, Grace started, could be their central repository. Marcus finished. The place where they store operational funds, where they launder money, where they keep documentation for paying off corrupt officials, where they hide assets between operations. Walter, Grace, if what you found is what I think it is, this could bring down one of the most violent and sophisticated criminal organizations in the entire Southwest. This could expose corruption in law enforcement, in banking, in local government. This is the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about, or the kind that gets witnesses killed. Walter said flatly. Walter, Marcus didn't deny it, didn't offer false reassurances. Yes, or that. I won't lie to you, the moment you walked into that vault, the moment you saw what was there, you put yourselves in danger. These people have unlimited resources, connections everywhere, and they've made it very clear over the years what happens to people who threaten their operations. We think they might already know, Grace said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. This morning, there was a man watching our home. A white car we didn't recognize, parked where he could see our door. He sat there for hours, just watching. Marcus's expression darkened considerably. Did he follow you here? Da. We don't think so. We took precautions, used public transit, transferred buses twice, watched for tails the whole way. Good. That might buy us some time. Marcus pulled out a different phone from his jacket, clearly a disposable burner, and made a quick call. He spoke in clipped sentences using law enforcement codes and abbreviations. Walter didn't fully understand, then hung up. I'm arranging protective custody. There's a safe house about 40 miles north of Phoenix, up in the foothills. It's secure, off any grid, monitored 24/7. You'll stay there while I figure out exactly who I can trust in the Bureau, who I can bring into this investigation without compromising your safety. How long? Walter asked. I don't know. Days, maybe weeks, possibly longer. These investigations take time to build properly, and your safety is the absolute priority. Marcus paused, studying their faces. You need to understand something. You can't go home. Not now. Probably not ever. Everything in that mobile home, everything you left behind, you need to consider it gone. These people will be watching it, searching it, using it to track your movements. Our whole lives are in that place, Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. I know. I'm sorry. But your whole lives won't mean anything if you're dead. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. Is there anyone else I need to worry about? Anyone who might be at risk because of their connection to you? We have a grandson in Oregon, Noah. He's 19, at university. If these people go after family, if they try to use him for leverage, give me his contact information right now. Marcus interrupted. Name, school, phone number, address, everything. We'll reach out to him today. Offer protective custody if he wants it. These organizations absolutely do look for leverage, for people they can threaten or hurt to pressure witnesses into staying quiet. Walter wrote down Noah's information on a napkin, his hand shaking badly enough that his writing came out barely legible. What do we tell him? How do we explain this? The truth, Marcus said, that you've become witnesses in a major federal investigation, that there may be threats, that we're offering protection. He's an adult, he gets to make his own choice about accepting. But I'll be honest with you, I'd strongly recommend he say yes. Anyone else? Marcus asked. Friends, family, people you're close to, people who might be targets. Walter and Grace looked at each other, and something passed between them, a realization both sad and strangely liberating. After Anna's death, after the distance that had grown between them and the rest of the family, after 3 years of increasing isolation in that forgotten mobile home park, they'd become ghosts even to the people who should have loved them most. No, Walter said quietly. There's no one else. Just us and Noah. Marcus nodded slowly, and Walter thought he saw something like sadness flicker in the agent's eyes, recognition of how alone they'd become, how thoroughly they'd been forgotten by everyone except the criminal organization that now wanted them dead. All right, Marcus said. I need you both to wait here. My people will arrive within the hour, 2 agents in an unmarked SUV. They'll take you to the safe house. Don't go outside. Don't use the bathroom unless I'm watching the door. Don't talk to anyone except the waitress. Understand? They both nodded. And Walter, Grace, what you've done, what you've found, it matters. It matters more than you know. People have been dying because of that cartel for decades. Families have been destroyed. Communities have been poisoned. And you might have just handed us the evidence to stop them. That takes courage. Or stupidity, Walter said. Marcus smiled grimly. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to look away from something just because it's dangerous to see. He stood, dropped cash on the table to cover their untouched coffee, and walked to the diner's front window where he could watch the parking lot. Walter and Grace sat together in their booth, holding hands across the table. 2 old people who'd gone out for a morning hike and somehow ended up at the center of a federal investigation. No regrets? Grace whispered. Walter thought about the vault, about the journal entries, about the border agent and the sheriff and all the other victims whose deaths had been recorded like business transactions. He thought about going back to their mobile home and pretending they'd never seen anything. Going back to those quiet days of crushing loneliness and invisible grief. No, he said firmly. No regrets. Whatever happens next, at least we matter again. At least we're doing something that means something. Grace squeezed his hand. Then, I guess we see this through. To the end, Walter agreed. Outside, the Arizona sun climbed higher, burning away the cool morning and promising another scorching day. Inside Rosie's diner, 2 forgotten souls waited for rescue or judgment or whatever came next, knowing only that their quiet life had ended and something far more dangerous and far more meaningful had begun. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning, but for the first time in 3 years, Walter and Grace Brennan felt truly alive. The safe house wasn't what Walter and Grace had imagined federal protection would look like. Not some sterile government facility or anonymous suburban rental, but an old ranch house nestled into the foothills north of Phoenix, surrounded by 40 acres of scrub and rock, where any approach would be visible for miles. 2 agents rotated 12-hour shifts, young and professional, treating Walter and Grace with respectful distance while maintaining constant vigilance. The first 3 days passed in anxious limbo. Walter and Grace occupied their time reviewing photographs, writing detailed statements, trying to remember every piece of information that might be useful. Marcus visited daily, each time bringing new questions, new developments, new reasons for concern. He'd assembled a small team of agents he trusted absolutely. People he'd worked with for years, people whose loyalty had been tested and proven in previous operations. On the fourth day, Marcus arrived with someone new. A woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes, and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms. She carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple trials, and her handshake was firm enough to make Walter wince. "This is Linda Castellanos," Marcus introduced, "Special Prosecutor for the Western District. She's handled more cartel cases than anyone else in the country, and she's never lost one." Castellanos settled into the ranch house living room, opened her briefcase, and pulled out a legal pad covered in precise handwriting. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, I've reviewed the evidence you provided. I've spent the last 72 hours going through every photograph, every document, every piece of information you collected from that vault. And I need you to understand something before we go any further." She paused, making sure she had their full attention. "What you've found is unprecedented. In 23 years of prosecuting organized crime, I have never seen evidence this comprehensive, this damning, this perfectly preserved. If we can authenticate all of this, if we can secure that physical location and verify the contents, we're looking at RICO charges against 67 individuals, conspiracy charges against another 140, money laundering, drug trafficking, murder for hire, corruption, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice. This could take down an entire criminal organization from the street-level dealers all the way up to the executive leadership. But, Walter prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in her tone, "But it also means you're in more danger than perhaps any witnesses I've ever worked with," Castellanos continued, her voice gentle but unflinchingly honest. "The Vasquez organization has resources that dwarf most legitimate businesses. They have connections in law enforcement, in banking, in government. They have sicarios, assassins who've killed federal agents, prosecutors, judges. They don't make idle threats, and they don't give up easily. Once we move forward with this investigation, once we start making arrests, your names will be everywhere. Court documents, news reports, defense attorney motions. You'll become the most visible targets imaginable." Grace's hand found Walter's, gripping tightly. "What are our options?" "Honestly, there are only two," Castellanos said. "Option 1, you walk away right now. We destroy the evidence, claim you made an honest mistake, misidentified what you saw. We put you in witness protection with completely new identities, relocate you somewhere far from Arizona, and you live out your lives in safety and anonymity. No one would blame you. You've already done more than most people would have the courage to do." "And option 2? Walter asked, though he already knew. "Option 2. We move forward with the full prosecution. We secure the vault location within 48 hours before evidence can be destroyed. We build airtight cases against every defendant. And you commit to seeing this through months of depositions, grand jury testimony, eventual trials that could last years. It means staying in protective custody, living under constant security, accepting that your old life is gone forever. And it means testifying in open court against some of the most dangerous people in North America." The silence in the room was absolute. One of the security agents shifted uncomfortably by the door. Somewhere outside, a bird called in the desert afternoon. "If we choose option 2, Grace said slowly, "what happens to the money? All those millions sitting in that vault?" Castellanos leaned forward. "That's an excellent question, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to meet you in person. Under federal forfeiture laws, all assets seized in criminal investigations become property of the government. Typically, a portion goes to the agencies involved. Some goes to the general treasury. But in cases involving large-scale victim losses, and this cartel has destroyed countless lives through drugs and violence, there's provision for victim restitution funds. Money can be distributed to families of people killed by the organization, to communities devastated by their operations, to treatment programs and prevention initiatives. So the money could actually help people. Walter asked. It wouldn't just disappear into government bureaucracy. I can't promise every dollar would be used perfectly. Castellanos admitted. Government is imperfect by nature. But I can promise that I would personally fight to ensure the majority goes to victim compensation and community restoration. I've done it before with other cases. There are families who've lost loved ones to Vasquez cartel violence, communities in Arizona and Mexico that have been torn apart by their operations. That money could rebuild lives, fund treatment centers, support children who've been orphaned by cartel violence. Walter looked at Grace, and in her eyes, he saw the same thing he felt in his own chest. Not just fear, but purpose. For 3 years, they'd been invisible, forgotten, convinced their lives no longer mattered. Their daughter was dead. Their grandchildren barely knew them. The world had moved on without them. They'd been ghosts haunting the edges of existence. But now they had the power to do something that mattered. Something that would echo beyond their own small lives. Something that would give meaning to every year of loneliness and grief they'd endured. We're in, Walter said firmly. All the way, whatever it takes. In Strun Manor, Grace nodded. We didn't survive losing Anna, didn't live through the worst pain imaginable, just to stay quiet now when we could actually help people. We're in. Castellanos smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd shown. I was hoping you'd say that, because the truth is, we need you. Without your testimony, without your first-hand account of what you found, our case is significantly weaker. You're not just witnesses. You're the foundation of everything we're about to build. Marcus stood. Then we move fast. I want tactical teams ready to secure that canyon location within 24 hours. Complete documentation, full forensic analysis, everything by the book, so it's bulletproof in court. Castellanos, I need warrants for. Already drafted, she interrupted, pulling papers from her briefcase. Just need a judge's signature, and I have one standing by. We move tomorrow morning, 0600 hours. The next 36 hours were a blur of activity. Walter and Grace spent hours with tactical team leaders, describing every detail of the canyon approach, the hidden entrance, the interior layout. They drew maps from memory, marked elevations and distances, described the stone door's mechanism. A team of engineers studied their descriptions and designed specialized equipment to breach the entrance without destroying evidence. On the evening before the raid, Noah arrived. Grace saw him first through the safe house window, a tall young man climbing out of an unmarked government SUV. His face so much like Anna's that Grace's breath caught in her throat. He was 19 now, on the edge of manhood, with his mother's dark hair and his grandfather's strong jawline. He carried a small duffel bag and moved with the uncertain gait of someone entering unknown territory. Grace was out the door before Walter could stop her, crossing the dusty yard at a speed her 70-year-old legs hadn't managed in years. Noah. He dropped his bag and caught her as she reached him, wrapping his arms around his grandmother with a fierceness that spoke of years of regret and distance. Grandma. God. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I stayed away so long. Walter joined them, And suddenly it was the three of them holding each other in the Arizona dust, crying and apologizing and piecing back together something that had been broken for too long. "Your mom would be so proud of what you're doing," Noah said when they finally separated, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "The FBI agent who came to get me, he told me everything. You found a cartel vault, and you're testifying against them. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard." "Or the stupidest," Walter said, but he was smiling. "Same thing sometimes," Noah replied, and Grace laughed through her tears because it was exactly what his mother would have said. That night, the three of them sat together in the ranch house living room, while Marcus and his team made final preparations in the adjacent rooms. They talked about Anna, really talked. For the first time since her death, they shared memories and regrets, spoke her name out loud without flinching, remembered her as the vibrant, complicated, deeply loved person she'd been, rather than the sanitized saint grief had tried to make her. "I was so angry after she died," Noah admitted quietly. "Angry at the cancer, angry at the world, angry at myself for not spending more time with her before the end. And then Dad remarried so fast, and we moved, and it felt easier to just forget, to start over without all the reminders. I told myself, you two were okay, that you had each other, but I was really just being a coward." "We all were," Grace said gently. "We all ran from the pain, instead of facing it together. But maybe we needed that time apart to figure out how to be together again. Or maybe," Walter added, "we needed something big enough to shake us out of our grief, something that reminded us there are things worth fighting for, worth staying alive for." At dawn, they stood together on the ranch house porch, watching the tactical convoy roll out 6 vehicles, full of FBI agents, DEA officers, forensic specialists, and enough firepower to take down a small army. Marcus stopped before climbing into the lead vehicle. "This is it," he said. "By noon, that vault will be empty, and the evidence will be in federal custody. You 3 stay here. Stay safe. We'll call when it's secure." Walter shook his hand. "Be careful, Marcus. The journal mentioned armed guards, security measures. These people don't give up their money easily." "Neither do we," Marcus replied with a grim smile. They watched the convoy disappear into the desert dawn, red taillights fading into blue morning. Then they went inside to wait, gathered around a laptop showing live feeds from body cameras and drone surveillance as the operation unfolded in real time. The approach took 2 hours, vehicles parking miles from the canyon, agents hiking in on foot, using the coordinates and maps Walter had provided. The drone footage showed them moving in tactical formation through the twisted rock passages, weapons ready, every sense alert. When they reached the hidden entrance, there was a tense moment as experts examined the stone door, looking for booby traps or alarm systems. Finding none, or at least none, they could detect, they used specialized hydraulic equipment to force it open, rather than risk the mechanism being rigged. The door swung inward, with a groan that carried clearly through the audio feed. Tactical teams flooded inside, lights sweeping the darkness, voices calling out clear signals as they secured each section. "Jesus Christ," someone breathed over the radio. "It's exactly like they described. It's all here." For 6 hours, they watched as the vault was systematically emptied. Forensic accountants catalogued every container. Document specialists photographed every page. Evidence technicians processed the scene with painstaking care. The leather journal was carefully bagged and tagged. The bearer bonds were documented and secured. The cash was counted $278 million in various currencies, exceeding even Walter's initial estimate. But the real treasure, the evidence that made Castellanos literally whoop with joy when she reviewed it, was the documentation. Ledgers detailing payments to corrupt officials with names, dates, and amounts. Contracts connecting legitimate businesses to drug distribution networks. Photographs of meetings between cartel leadership and people who appeared in government directories and corporate annual reports. Bank account numbers, shell company registrations, money transfer records spanning 2 decades. "This is a prosecutor's dream," Castellanos said, reviewing the feeds. "This is everything. This is the smoking gun, the paper trail, the incontrovertible proof." They kept perfect records because they never imagined anyone would find this place. The arrests began the next morning, coordinated raids across 3 states and 2 countries. News helicopters captured footage of federal agents leading men in expensive suits from million-dollar homes, from law offices and bank headquarters and government buildings. The mugshots that appeared on evening news broadcasts included a state senator, 2 judges, a police chief, 17 law enforcement officers, 32 business executives, and Carlos Vasquez himself, the organization's leader, arrested at his ranch outside Guadalajara. Walter and Grace watched the coverage from the safe house, Noah between them, all 3 silent as the scope of what they'd set in motion became clear. This wasn't just arresting criminals. This was exposing systemic corruption, revealing connections that went to the highest levels of power and wealth. Southwest Cartel dismantled in massive federal bust. Read the headlines. 278 million seized in Desert Vault. Dozens arrested in corruption scandal spanning 2 decades. But what captured the public's attention? What turned their story into something bigger than just another drug bust? Was the human element. The news cycles couldn't get enough of it. 2 elderly park rangers, out for a morning hike, who stumbled onto the biggest cartel bust in Southwest history and chose to come forward despite the danger. Within 48 hours, their names and faces were everywhere. News crews camped outside the mobile home park in Copper Ridge. Reporters dug into their background, discovered Anna's death, learned about their years of lonely isolation. The narrative practically wrote itself. Forgotten heroes, redeemed by courage, proving that ordinary people could still stand up to evil. Not all the attention was welcome. Threats poured in through social media, email, voicemail, crude and terrifying promises of violence. Markers had to increase their security detail, relocate them twice when specific threats seemed credible. The Vasquez organization, even with its leadership in custody, still had loyalists and resources. But something unexpected happened as the story spread. Letters began arriving, handwritten notes from strangers across the country, emails routed through the FBI, messages left with news organizations. People whose lives had been touched by cartel violence, whose families had been destroyed by drugs, whose communities had been devastated by organized crime. Grace read them aloud in the evenings, her voice breaking on nearly every one. "My brother was killed by the Vasquez cartel 3 years ago for refusing to transport drugs through his trucking company. The police said it was a robbery, but we knew the truth. Thank you for having the courage to speak. Thank you for making his death mean something. Our town has been dying for 20 years because of drug addiction. Families destroyed, children orphaned. What you did gives us hope that maybe we can rebuild. Thank you. I'm a former DEA agent who investigated this cartel for a decade. They threatened my family, forced me to resign, seeing them finally face justice because of two brave people. It restored my faith that good can still win. One letter came from the widow of the border agent mentioned in the journal. The one who'd been eliminated in Nogales. She'd spent 15 years believing her husband's murder would never be solved, never knowing why he died. "You gave me answers," she wrote. "You gave me the truth about what happened to him and why. That's a gift I can never repay. He died trying to stop these people, and now, because of you, his death finally matters. Thank you for being braver than the people with badges who looked away." Walter read that letter 3 times, then quietly put it in a folder he was keeping. "We're going to need these," he told Grace, "for the hard days ahead, to remember why we're doing this." The trial process stretched across months. Grand jury testimony, pre-trial motions, defense attorney challenges, endless depositions. Walter and Grace spent weeks in conference rooms, recounting every detail of their discovery, identifying people in photographs, explaining the journal entries they'd documented. The defense tried every angle to discredit them. They suggested Walter and Grace had fabricated evidence, planted documents, exaggerated what they'd found. They portrayed them as attention seekers, lonely old people desperate for relevance. But Castellanos was relentless. She walked juries through the evidence step by step, showing how Walter and Grace's accounts matched the physical evidence perfectly, how the documentation they'd photographed was authenticated through forensic analysis, how their testimony was corroborated by hundreds of other pieces of evidence. The first trial focused on Carlos Vasquez himself. When Walter took the stand, he faced the man whose organization had killed federal agents, corrupted officials, and destroyed countless lives. Vasquez stared at him with cold, calculating eyes, trying to intimidate through silence. Walter stared right back. "Mr. Brennan," Castellanos asked, "can you describe what you found in the vault on the morning of April 17th? Walter's voice was steady, clear, unflinching. He described the cash, the bonds, the journal entries, the evidence of corruption. He read directly from the journal passages about eliminated witnesses, his voice never wavering even when Vasquez's attorney objected repeatedly. When the defense attorney tried to shake him on cross-examination, suggesting his memory was faulty, his eyesight poor, his account unreliable, Walter simply pulled out photographs. "I'm 72 years old," he said. "My eyesight might not be what it was, but my camera works just fine. And that journal you're claiming doesn't exist? We photographed every single page. Would you like me to read more entries about the people your client had killed?" The courtroom erupted. The judge had to call for order. Vasquez's attorney requested a recess. But the damage was done. Walter had called their bluff, and the jury saw it. Grace's testimony was equally powerful. She described the sophisticated security measures, the maintained supplies, the clear evidence of ongoing operations. She spoke directly to the jury, making eye contact, speaking from the heart about what it meant to stumble onto evil and choose to confront it rather than look away. "We're not heroes," she said during her testimony. "We're just two old people who lost everything that mattered to us and then found something worth fighting for. Those documents represent real victims, real families destroyed. We couldn't walk away from that. We couldn't let it stay hidden just because we were scared." The verdicts came in waves over the following months. Carlos Vasquez, guilty on all 63 counts. Life, imprisonment without possibility of parole. The state senator, guilty on 27 counts, 40 years. The police chief, guilty on 19 counts, 30 years. One by one, the dominoes fell, the criminal empire dismantled by the evidence two elderly park rangers had documented on a spring morning. But the real victory came later, in the ways the money was used. Castellanos fought hard to ensure the seized assets went primarily to victim compensation and community restoration, rather than government coffers. Of the $278 million recovered, $140 million was designated for a victim restitution fund, the largest ever created in Southwest cartel case history. Families of people killed by the Vasquez organization received compensation that couldn't bring back loved ones but could pay off mortgages, fund college educations, provide therapy and support. Communities devastated by drug addiction received grants for treatment centers, prevention programs, youth initiatives. The border agent's widow received a settlement that allowed her to finally retire with dignity. Another $50 million was designated for law enforcement training and anti-corruption initiatives, strengthening systems to prevent future infiltration. $20 million went to rehabilitation programs for people whose lives had been destroyed by addiction to drugs distributed by the organization. The remaining $68 million, after legal fees and agency costs, funded a scholarship program for children who'd lost parents to cartel violence, ensuring that the next generation had opportunities the previous one had been denied. Walter and Grace were invited to the press conference where Castellanos announced the restitution fund distribution. They stood at the back of the room, uncomfortable with attention, but when she called them forward to acknowledge their role, the room erupted in applause. These two people, Castellanos said, emotion thickening her voice, could have walked away. They could have chosen safety over justice, silence over courage. Instead, they chose to stand up. And because of that choice, because of their bravery, hundreds of families are receiving justice today. Communities are receiving resources to heal. Children are receiving opportunities they would never have had. This is what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away from evil. The applause continued for a full minute. Walter and Grace stood together, holding hands, overwhelmed by the moment. They weren't forgotten anymore. They weren't invisible. They mattered. Noah stood in the front row, tears streaming down his face, clapping until his hands hurt. Life didn't return to normal because there was no normal to return to. The mobile home in Copper Ridge was long gone, sold by the park owners. When the rent went unpaid, their possessions donated or discarded. But Walter and Grace discovered they didn't miss it. That place had been a tomb, a monument to grief, a space where they'd gone to wait for death. With money from the Federal Witness Reward Program, a percentage of the seized assets paid to witnesses who provide essential evidence, they bought a small house in the foothills outside Prescott, Arizona. Nothing fancy. Just a two-bedroom place with a porch and a view of mountains where they could watch sunsets without feeling like ghosts. Noah transferred to Northern Arizona University to be closer, visiting every weekend, slowly rebuilding the relationship that grief had fractured. He brought friends, brought textbooks to study at their kitchen table, brought laughter and life back into their world. They started a routine, not the aimless hiking of their lonely years, but purposeful walks through the mountains they loved, identifying plants and tracking wildlife, and feeling connected to the landscape that had been their life's work. They volunteered at a local community center, teaching wilderness safety and conservation to young people. They spoke at schools about courage and civic duty when asked. But the most meaningful transformation was internal. Walter and Grace had spent 3 years believing their lives no longer mattered, that they were just marking time until death. The vault changed that not because of the money or the recognition, but because it reminded them who they were at their core. They were people who noticed things others missed. People who cared about places others overlooked. People who believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous, even when they were terrified. 1 year after the discovery, they received an invitation to speak at a law enforcement conference in Phoenix. The topic: the power of citizen witnesses in combating organized crime. Walter initially declined, uncomfortable with public speaking, uncomfortable with being held up as examples. But Grace changed his mind. "We're not doing this for ourselves," she said. "We're doing it so that the next person who stumbles onto something like this knows they don't have to stay silent. We're doing it to show that ordinary people can still make a difference." The conference room held 300 law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and federal agents. Walter and Grace stood at the podium, nervous but determined, and told their story. They talked about the loneliness that had consumed them after Anna's death, about feeling invisible and forgotten. They described finding the vault, the fear that followed, the threats they'd received. But mostly, they talked about the choice they'd faced: safety or justice, silence or courage. "We're not special," Walter told the audience. "We're just two old people who spent our lives protecting land nobody cared about, who lost our daughter and became ghosts in our own lives. But when we found that vault, when we saw the evidence of all the harm that organization had caused, we had to make a choice about what kind of people we wanted to be. The easy choice would have been to walk away," Grace continued, "to pretend we'd never seen anything, to go back to our quiet life, and wait for the phone to ring. But we'd already lost everything that mattered most to us. What did we have left to lose except the chance to do something that actually meant something?" The room was silent except for their voices. "So we chose to stand up," Walter said. "Not because we were brave, but because staying silent would have meant all those victims, the border agent, the sheriff, the families destroyed by drugs, their suffering would continue to not matter. And we couldn't live with that." When they finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Afterwards, officers and agents lined up to shake their hands, to thank them, to tell them stories about investigations that had stalled because witnesses were too afraid to come forward. One young FBI agent, barely 30, waited until everyone else had gone. "My dad was that border agent," she said quietly. "The one mentioned in the journal. The one killed in Nogales. I became an agent because of him. Because I wanted to finish what he started. And you did. You finished it. Thank you." Grace hugged her tightly, both women crying. And Walter thought about the strange paths life takes, about how loss and purpose intertwine in ways we can never predict. 2 years after the discovery, Copper Ridge, the forgotten town where they'd lived in isolation, received a grant from the Victim Restitution Fund to build a new community center with drug prevention programs and youth services. The town council voted unanimously to name it the Brennan Center, after the 2 residents who'd brought attention to the cartel's impact on small communities. Walter and Grace attended the dedication ceremony, uncomfortable with the attention but moved by what the center represented. It wasn't about them, it was about taking something born from darkness and violence and transforming it into hope and opportunity for the next generation. The director of the center, a social worker named Maria who'd lost her son to cartel-distributed drugs, spoke at the ceremony. "This building exists because 2 people refused to look away. Because they chose courage over comfort. Because they believed that ordinary people can still fight evil and win." Every child who walks through these doors, every family that finds help here, is a testament to their choice. Standing on that porch with Grace beside him, Noah in the crowd, the Arizona sun warm on his face, Walter felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Peace. Purpose. The bone-deep satisfaction of knowing his life had meant something. That evening, back in their small house in the Prescott foothills, Walter and Grace sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Noah had gone back to university, promising to visit next weekend. The house was quiet but not empty, silent but not lonely. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. The same question she'd asked 2 years ago, in a very different context. Finding that vault? Everything that came after? Walter thought about the threats they'd received, the months in protective custody, the fear that had become their constant companion. He thought about testifying in court, facing down men who'd killed without hesitation, choosing justice over safety again and again. But he also thought about the letters from grateful families, about the victim fund helping people rebuild their lives, about the border agent's daughter finishing her father's work. He thought about Noah coming back into their lives, about purpose replacing loneliness, about mattering again. "No," he said finally. "Not for a second. We spent 3 years being ghosts, Grace. 3 years invisible and forgotten, just waiting to die. But that morning in Red Canyon, when we found that entrance and decided to step inside, we chose to be alive again. Everything that followed, the fear, the trials, the threats, it was all worth it, because we mattered again. We made a difference." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, the same gesture she'd made 10,000 times over 50 years of marriage. Anna would be proud. She would, Walter agreed. She'd also tell us we were idiots for walking into a cartel vault at our age. Grace laughed. Probably both. Proud and convinced we'd lost our minds. They sat together as darkness fell, as stars emerged overhead, as the desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds and scents. Somewhere out there, the canyon where they'd made their discovery sat empty now. The vault sealed with concrete, the evidence long since removed. But the impact of what they'd found continued to ripple outward, touching lives they'd never meet, changing futures they'd never see. 3 years ago, Walter and Grace Brennan had been 2 of the loneliest people in America, forgotten by family, invisible to their community, convinced their best years were behind them, and nothing but slow decline lay ahead. But they'd stumbled into a crack in a rock formation, pushed open a door that should have stayed closed, and found not just $278 million in cartel money. They'd found purpose. They'd found courage. They'd found proof that it's never too late to matter, never too late to stand for something, never too late to choose justice over safety, and discover that ordinary people can still change the world. The money was gone, now distributed to victims, invested in communities, transformed from a tool of evil into an instrument of healing. But the real treasure they'd found that morning wasn't in the vault at all. It was in rediscovering who they were. Park rangers who'd spent their lives protecting overlooked places, who'd learned to see what others missed, who believed that forgotten things could still matter if someone cared enough to notice them. They'd been forgotten themselves until they chose to be unforgettable. They'd been invisible until they chose to stand in the light. They'd been waiting to die until they chose to truly live. And in choosing courage over fear, in choosing justice over safety, in choosing to matter one more time, Walter and Grace Brennan had written an ending to their story, that no one could have predicted. Not an ending at all. Really, a beginning. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to look at what others ignore. Strong enough to stand when staying seated would be easier, and stubborn enough to believe that one choice, one moment, one decision to do the right thing can echo far beyond the limits of a single life. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, as the desert night embraced the small house, where two formerly forgotten souls now lived with purpose, Walter and Grace held hands and knew with absolute certainty that they had not stumbled into that vault by accident. They'd been led there by every choice they'd made across 7 decades of life. Every trail they'd walked, every detail they'd noticed, every overlooked place they'd protected, every lesson learned about seeing value in things others dismissed. Their whole lives had prepared them for that moment. They just hadn't known it until they stepped through a door carved into stone and discovered that sometimes the biggest treasures aren't gold or diamonds or cash. Sometimes the biggest treasure is simply knowing that when it mattered most, when the choice was between silence and courage, between safety and justice, between forgetting and mattering, you chose right. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Click to keep discovering what happens when courage meets fate. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe it's never too late to make a difference. Never too old to be brave, and never wrong to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world says to stay down.